Something is happening right now that most of the world has no idea about. And by the time you finish watching this, you will understand why it terrifies some of the most powerful intelligence agencies on the planet. Imagine waking up tomorrow and the internet is gone. Not slow, not glitchy, gone. No banking, no communication, no emergency services running on digital infrastructure, no global markets, no supply chains, coordinated through satellite networks, just silence. Digital darkness across entire regions of the Earth. That is not a science fiction scenario anymore. That is the exact capability Iran has been quietly building for years. And right now, in this moment, American military planners are not sleeping well because of it. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is not speculation from anonymous bloggers. It is the outcome of years of satellite programs, underwater cable mapping operations, cyber warfare investments, and a geopolitical strategy so bold that even Iran's enemies have been forced to respect the ambition behind it. The question is not whether Iran can disrupt global internet infrastructure. The question that keeps experts awake at night is how far they are willing to go, and whether the United States military response that is already being deployed will be enough to stop it. Stay with this, because what unfolds from here gets much darker before it gets clearer. For most people, the internet feels like air. You cannot see it, you cannot touch it. But the moment it disappears, you feel it everywhere. It powers hospitals. It moves trillions of dollars every single day. It keeps aircraft coordinated. It connects military bases across continents. It runs the invisible architecture of modern civilization. And here is something most people have never thought about. The internet is not floating in the cloud. It is not magic. It runs through physical cables. Enormous, fragile, expensive cables that sit on the floor of the ocean. Thousands of miles of fiber optic lines buried under the Atlantic, under the Pacific, under the Red Sea, under the Persian Gulf, right next to Iran. Right next to Iran's sphere of influence. That geographic reality is not lost on Iranian military strategists. In fact, it is one of the most important cards they hold, and they have been studying that hand very carefully. But before we get to what Iran is planning and what the United States has already started doing in response, we need to understand how we arrived at this moment. Because this did not happen overnight. This is the result of decades of conflict, isolation, humiliation, and a very deliberate Iranian decision to fight the next war on a completely different battlefield. Iran has been under American-led economic sanctions for over 4 decades. Since 1979, the relationship between Tehran and Washington has been defined by pressure, retaliation, proxy conflict, and escalation. Iran has watched the United States destroy its neighbors. It watched what happened to Iraq in 2003. It watched Libya collapse in 2011. It watched Syria bleed for over a decade. And Iran drew one very clear conclusion from all of it. You cannot fight the United States conventionally and win, so Iran chose a different path. They invested in what military analysts call asymmetric warfare, the ability to cause maximum disruption at minimum cost. Proxy militias across the Middle East, ballistic missile programs that can reach regional capitals within minutes, drone technology that can overwhelm traditional air defense systems, and a cyber warfare division that has grown from a small intelligence unit into one of the most sophisticated state-sponsored hacking organizations on Earth. But what happened next changed everything. In 2021 and 2022, something shifted inside Iranian military doctrine. The conversations in Tehran stopped being just about regional power. They started being about something bigger, something global. Iranian leadership began seriously studying what it would take to reach beyond the Middle East and touch the infrastructure that the entire modern world depends on. And the answer they found was sitting right under the sea. Submarine internet cables are the hidden backbone of the global economy. There are over 400 of them crisscrossing the world's oceans right now. They carry approximately 95% of all international internet traffic. Every financial transaction between New York and London. Every military communication between Washington and its bases in the Gulf. Every piece of data moving between Asia and Europe travels through these cables. And in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, some of the most critical cables in the world run directly through waters where Iran and its allied forces operate. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Strait of Hormuz. These are not just choke points for oil. They are choke points for the digital world. And Iran has positioned itself over many years with naval forces, proxy groups, and underwater surveillance capability in and around these exact locations. This is where things take a serious turn. In 2023 and into 2024, intelligence reports began surfacing that Iranian naval units and the Houthi forces in Yemen, who operate under close Iranian coordination, were not just blocking ships in the Red Sea. They were conducting something far more concerning. They were mapping cables, conducting underwater surveys, building an operational understanding of where the critical fiber optic infrastructure sits on the seafloor. Think about what that means for a moment. You do not map cables unless you are thinking about cutting them. You do not invest in underwater surveillance unless you're planning to use that information for something. and you do not position forces around undersea infrastructure for years without a strategic purpose. The Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea that dominated headlines for months were alarming. But military analysts will tell you quietly that the shipping attacks may have been a cover story, a distraction. The real intelligence prize was learning the precise location of the cables while the world was watching the burning tankers. And the cables they were studying carry data for Europe, Asia, East Africa, and the Middle East. A successful series of coordinated cuts at the right choke points would not just inconvenience the internet, it would sever entire continents from each other digitally. Financial markets would freeze, communications between governments would be disrupted, military coordination in the region would be compromised. The economic damage from even a 72-hour global internet disruption has been estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and that is a conservative figure. But here is what most people do not realize. Iran is not planning to do this in isolation. Iran does not operate in a vacuum, and the strategic timing of any potential infrastructure attack would not be chosen randomly. It would be chosen at a moment of maximum pressure, a moment when Iran felt cornered, a moment when the United States was already stretched thin across multiple theaters, or a moment when Iran wanted to demonstrate to the world that it possessed a weapon no one could easily stop. That moment may be closer than anyone is comfortable admitting. Because right now, the pressure on Iran is at levels not seen in years. American and Israeli operations have struck Iranian-backed infrastructure across the region. Iranian proxies have suffered significant losses. The nuclear negotiations that were supposed to create an off-ramp have stalled, and hardliners inside Iran who believe that the only way to survive is to strike first, strike hard, and strike in ways that no one expects. Those voices are getting louder inside Tehran. And they are pointing at the cables. That makes this so frightening is the nature of the vulnerability itself. These cables are not military infrastructure. They are commercial. They are owned by private companies and international consortiums. They are protected by almost nothing. In the open ocean, a cable is a thin wire on the bottom of the sea with no guards, no alarms, and no real-time monitoring in most sections. Historically, cables have been cut accidentally by ships dropping anchors, by underwater landslides, by fishing trawlers dragging nets across the seafloor. And every time it happens accidentally, repairs take weeks, sometimes months. Because you have to locate the break, deploy a specialized cable ship, and conduct an incredibly complex deep-sea repair operation. Now imagine those cuts are not accidents. Imagine they are coordinated. Imagine they happen in multiple locations simultaneously, in areas where Iranian-aligned naval assets or armed groups already operate. Imagine the cuts happen at the same time as a missile strike or a cyber attack that is designed to overwhelm response systems. This is what American military planners call a combined arms digital attack. And it is precisely the scenario that has pushed the United States military into a response that is already underway. Let us talk about what the United States has done, because the response is significant, and it reveals just how seriously the threat is being taken at the highest levels. The United States Fifth Fleet, which is permanently stationed in Bahrain and oversees naval operations across the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the broader Middle East maritime region, has quietly expanded its underwater domain awareness mission. What that means in plain language is that American submarines, unmanned underwater vehicles, and specialized naval assets are being deployed to monitor and protect critical cable infrastructure in the region. This is not public information that gets announced at press conferences. It surfaces in defense budget documents and congressional testimony, and technical reports from think tanks with ties to the intelligence community. But it is happening. Additionally, the United States Cyber Command, which is the military organization responsible for offensive and defensive cyber operations, has been specifically tasked with developing countermeasures against Iranian infrastructure attack scenarios. This includes not just cyber defense of digital systems, but coordination with the private sector companies that own and operate the global cable network. For the first time in history, the American military is sitting in rooms with cable company executives, mapping vulnerabilities together and developing emergency response protocols for what happens if the worst-case scenario becomes real. That tells you something important. When the Pentagon starts meeting with telecommunications companies about war planning, something serious is being anticipated. But there is another dimension to the American response that is even more revealing. The United States has been rapidly accelerating its satellite internet capability. Programs like Starlink, which is operated by SpaceX, have been discussed at the Pentagon as a strategic redundancy layer. The idea is that if submarine cables are disrupted, satellite internet could serve as a backup for critical government and military communications. American military contracts with commercial satellite providers have expanded significantly in the past 2 years. But here is the problem with that solution. And it is a problem Iran's military strategists understand very well. Satellites are not immune either. This is where Iran's strategy becomes even more complex. Because Iran is not just thinking about cables. Iran has been developing, testing, and demonstrating anti-satellite weapons capability. Iranian military officials have publicly celebrated their ability to jam GPS signals, interfere with satellite communications, and conduct operations in space that threaten the orbital assets Western nations depend on. In 2020, Iran launched its first military satellite. In 2022, they launched another. These were not just propaganda exercises. They were demonstrations of capability, demonstrations that Iran can reach into space. And what goes up can be used to target what is already up there. The combination of undersea cable vulnerability and satellite vulnerability creates what strategists call a double-layer attack surface. Iran does not need to do both simultaneously. It just needs the threat of both to create uncertainty. Uncertainty is a weapon. Uncertainty forces the enemy to spread its resources thin to defend everything at once, which means defending nothing perfectly. And Iran has studied this playbook very carefully because they learned it from the best. They learned it from watching how the United States projects power. However, this is where things take a serious turn in a direction that many people have not anticipated. Iran's internet disruption capability is not only directed outward. There is an internal dimension to this story that is equally important and deeply troubling. Iran has been building what intelligence analysts have called a national internet, a closed digital system that would allow the Iranian government to disconnect the country from the global internet entirely while keeping its own internal communications running. This is called the National Information Network in Iran, and it has been under development for years. The significance of this cannot be overstated. If Iran can sever itself from the global internet while simultaneously attacking global internet infrastructure, it creates an asymmetric situation where Iran absorbs minimal damage from any retaliatory cyber operation, while the rest of the world suffers maximum disruption. You cannot threaten someone with internet disconnection if they have already prepared to live without the internet. This is the digital equivalent of building a bunker before launching an attack. Iran has been building its bunker for years, and it is nearly complete. Iranian citizens know this story from the inside. During major protests, the Iranian government has repeatedly shut down domestic internet access to prevent organizers from coordinating and to stop images of crackdowns from reaching the outside world. In November 2019, Iran shut down the internet almost completely for nearly 2 weeks. In 2022, during the protests that followed the death of Mahsa Amini, internet shutdowns were deployed repeatedly. Each of these events was not just a tool of internal repression, they were also field tests, technical rehearsals. Iran was learning how to manage a national internet disconnection, what systems broke down, what worked, what needed improvement. Every internal shutdown made the National Information Network more resilient and more capable. The world watched those protests and felt sympathy for Iranian citizens losing their internet. What most observers missed was that they were watching Iran conduct live-fire exercises for a capability that goes far beyond internal control. What most people do not realize is that the timeline for Iran reaching full operational capability on its national internet has been accelerating. Estimates that once placed it 5 or 6 years away are now being revised. The combination of technical development, Chinese cooperation on censorship and network architecture, and the lessons learned from repeated domestic shutdowns suggest Iran may be much closer than anyone publicly acknowledges. And when that capability is fully online, the strategic calculation changes completely. Because right now, Iran is deterred from certain escalations by the knowledge that any major attack would result in devastating cyber retaliation against Iranian infrastructure. Iranian banks, power grids, oil facilities, and government systems are all vulnerable to American and Israeli cyber operations. That vulnerability creates a form of mutual digital deterrence. But once Iran has a fully functioning national internet that can be sealed off from the global network, that deterrence disappears. Iran could launch massive cyber and physical attacks against global internet infrastructure and then disconnect itself before the counterstrikes arrive. Like a boxer who throws a punch and then hides behind a wall. The wall is almost built. American intelligence has been tracking this development with growing alarm, and it has changed the nature of the conversations happening inside the Pentagon, inside the NSA, and inside the intelligence agencies of America's allies in Europe and the Middle East. The question is no longer just, how do we stop an Iranian attack? The question is becoming, what do we do if Iran reaches a point where the attacks become essentially cost-free for them? That is a question without a comfortable answer. But let us go even deeper, because there is a layer to this story that almost no one is talking about publicly. Iran does not act alone. Iran is part of a broader alignment of nations and non-state actors that share a common interest in weakening American global dominance. Russia, China, North Korea, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, these actors do not always coordinate formally. But they share intelligence, they share technology, they share strategic interest. And when we talk about Iran threatening global internet infrastructure, We cannot separate that from the broader context of what Russia demonstrated in Ukraine, what China is doing in the South China Sea with underwater cables, and what North Korea is doing with its rapidly expanding cyber operations. The world is witnessing the emergence of a new kind of warfare, not armies crossing borders, not missiles striking cities, but attacks on the invisible infrastructure that modern civilization cannot survive without. Power grids, water systems, financial networks, and the internet that connects all of it. Iran is not pioneering this approach, but Iran may be the actor most willing to actually use it in the most aggressive way, because Iran has the least to lose in a sanctions-ravaged economy, because Iran has the geographic position to do it, and because Iran has been pushed to a point where its leadership genuinely believes that demonstrating this capability is the only way to force the world to take them seriously. This is where the situation becomes genuinely dangerous. Deterrence theory, the entire foundation of nuclear and conventional military strategy since World War II, is built on the assumption that both sides fear the consequences of escalation, that the costs of an attack outweigh the benefits, that rational actors will step back from the edge. But what happens when one actor has convinced itself that the cost of not attacking is higher than the cost of attacking? What happens when a country believes that if it does not act now, it will be destroyed or dismantled anyway? That is when deterrence breaks down. That is when history's most dangerous moments have occurred. Iran may be approaching that psychological and strategic threshold. The nuclear program is under threat. The proxy network has taken losses. The economy is suffering. The population is restless. And the hardliners who believe in maximum pressure, as a response to maximum pressure, are in control of the narrative inside Tehran's security establishment. In that context, attacking global internet infrastructure is not irrational. It is, from a certain dark and desperate perspective, logical. Now let us talk about what a real-world disruption would actually look like, because understanding the consequence helps you understand the gravity of what is at stake. It begins quietly, a ship's anchor catching on a cable somewhere in the Red Sea. Except it is not an anchor. It is a specialized cutting device deployed by a submarine or an unmanned underwater vehicle. The cut happens at 3 a.m. local time. By the time it is detected and reported by the cable monitoring company, 2 hours have passed. In those 2 hours, 2 more cuts happen, one near the Strait of Hormuz, one in the Persian Gulf. And simultaneously, a series of cyber attacks, the kind Iran has been developing and testing for years, hit the network operations centers of 3 major internet exchange points in the region. Within 6 hours of the first cut, large portions of the Middle East, East Africa, South Asia, and parts of Europe begin experiencing severe internet degradation, not complete loss, because the global cable network has redundancy. Traffic reroutes, but rerouting takes capacity from other cables. Congestion builds, speeds drop, services begin failing. Financial markets in Dubai, Mumbai, Nairobi open for the morning session to find their trading systems running at a fraction of normal speed. Transactions that normally process in milliseconds are taking seconds. Algorithms built on microsecond timing begin making errors. Risk management systems that rely on real-time data start issuing incorrect signals. Automated trading halts kick in. Hundreds of millions of dollars are lost before anyone fully understands what is happening. Airlines in the region find their real-time communication with air traffic control degraded. Hospitals running telemedicine systems lose connectivity with specialists. Emergency response coordination networks slow down. And across social media, chaos begins to spread as people realize something is very wrong, but no one knows exactly what. This is not a Hollywood disaster film. This is a technically feasible scenario that cybersecurity professionals and military analysts have wargamed in detail. And every time they run the simulation, the conclusion is the same. The world is far more vulnerable than the public understands. And the repair timeline is far longer than anyone would want. Fixing a single deep-sea cable break requires mobilizing a specialized cable repair ship, which there are fewer than 60 of in the entire world. Navigating to the location, locating the exact breakpoint, and conducting a repair that takes days under ideal conditions. Multiple, simultaneous breaks mean multiple ships, and the global fleet of repair vessels cannot be everywhere at once. Weeks of partial disruption, weeks of degraded internet across entire regions, the economic damage compounding every hour. And here is the part that makes military planners genuinely desperate. There is no quick military response that prevents this from happening once it starts. You cannot bomb your way to a fixed cable. You cannot sanction a cut wire back together. The damage is immediate and the repair is slow. The only real defense is prevention, which means detecting and stopping the attack before the first cut is made. And that is exactly what the United States military response is focused on. Detection before disruption. That is the mission. American undersea surveillance technology is among the most advanced in the world. The Sound surveillance system The networks of underwater hydrophones, the classified underwater sensor arrays that have been expanded and modernized in recent years, these systems are designed to detect submarine movements and unusual underwater activity. New investments in autonomous underwater vehicles, sometimes called AUVs, have been deployed specifically for cable monitoring in high-risk areas. These unmanned machines can patrol cable routes continuously, detect anomalies, and alert human operators to threats in real time. American satellite surveillance has been retasked to monitor Iranian naval movements, Houthi maritime operations, and the movement of vessels with underwater operational capability in and around critical cable corridors. And diplomatically, the United States has been quietly pressuring allies in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Oman, to share intelligence on suspicious maritime activity near their coastal waters, which happen to sit adjacent to some of the most critical cable landing stations in the world. The cable landing stations are the points where underwater cables come ashore and connect to the land-based internet infrastructure. They are physical buildings in specific locations. They are far easier to locate than the cables themselves, and they represent concentrated vulnerability. If you cannot cut the cable under the sea, you can attack the building where the cable meets the land. Iranian-backed proxy groups have operated in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza, all of which are near or adjacent to countries with cable landing stations. The concern that a coordinated attack combining underwater cable cuts with land-based strikes on landing stations and cyber attacks on internet exchange points represents an existential threat to regional digital infrastructure, is being taken with complete seriousness by American and allied military commands. The United States Marine Corps, which has been redesigning itself specifically for maritime operations in contested environments, has developed new rapid deployment concepts for defending coastal infrastructure. Special operations forces have been briefed on scenarios involving the protection of cable landing stations. This is not theoretical planning anymore. This is operational preparation. And yet, despite all of this preparation, the honest assessment inside classified briefings is that a truly determined and sophisticated attack by Iran and its network of proxies could not be completely prevented. It could be degraded. It could be made more costly. The attacker could suffer significant losses. But the idea of a perfect defense of thousands of miles of undersea cable across multiple bodies of water is not realistic. Which brings us to the darkest part of this story. If the attack cannot be perfectly prevented, then the real deterrence has to come from the threat of consequences so severe that Iran concludes the attack is not worth it. And this is where the United States military response goes beyond defensive preparation and enters the territory of active deterrence through demonstrated offensive capability. American cyber forces have made very clear through deliberately leaked information and through actions that Iran's intelligence services could not miss that the United States has prepositioned cyber weapons inside Iranian critical infrastructure, not as espionage, as tripwires, as warnings, as the digital equivalent of a loaded gun pointed at the things Iran's government needs to survive. Iran's oil export systems, its power grid, its financial network, its military command and control systems. American cyber operations have spent years mapping and, in some cases, quietly penetrating these systems, not to destroy them, but to demonstrate that the capability to destroy them exists and is ready. This is a message, a very clear message, delivered not in words but in capability. The message is, if you touch the cables, we will turn off your country. Whether Iran believes that message is credible, whether Iranian decision-makers accept that the United States would actually execute on that threat, whether the hardliners in Tehran who favor escalation are deterred by it or emboldened to move first before the trap springs. Those are the questions that have no certain answers. And those uncertain answers represent the most dangerous gap in the current security situation. Because we are living in a moment where the threshold for catastrophic conflict is being tested in ways that have not been seen since the Cold War. Not nuclear conflict, but infrastructure conflict. The kind of conflict that does not produce mushroom clouds and radiation, but produces weeks of darkness, economic collapse, and the terrifying realization that the modern world's nervous system is not nearly as protected as we believed. Iran knows this. The United States knows this. And both sides are maneuvering around a line that neither wants to be the first to visibly cross, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that the other side will. The most important thing to understand about this situation is that it is not static. It is moving. It is developing. The Iranian nuclear program continues to advance, and every advancement creates more pressure on the timeline. American and allied operations against Iranian proxies continue, and every operation creates more pressure inside Tehran. The economic pain of sanctions continues, and every month of that pain makes the calculus of escalation slightly more tempting for those who believe Iran has nothing left to lose through restraint. The world is not standing still, and neither is the threat. There's a final piece of this story that almost never gets discussed in public, and it might be the most important of all. The global internet was built by the private sector. It is not owned by governments. It is not protected by armies. The companies that own the cables, the data centers, the internet exchange points, the satellite systems, they are corporations with shareholders and quarterly earnings calls. They were not designed for wartime. They were not built to withstand nation-state attacks. And they do not have the resources or the mandate to defend themselves against a military adversary. This creates a fundamental mismatch. The infrastructure of modern civilization sits largely outside the protection of the entities whose job it is to protect civilization. And Iran has understood that mismatch for a long time. The American military response, however serious and however sophisticated, is trying to close a gap that has been building for decades. The marriage of military protection and private infrastructure is a very recent and very uncomfortable partnership. The rules, the legal frameworks, the operational protocols for how American military forces defend privately owned cable infrastructure from a state-sponsored attack are still being written. That is terrifying. Not because the people writing those rules are incompetent, but because the threat does not wait for the rules to be finished. And that is where we are right now, standing at the edge of a new kind of conflict, one that most people cannot see because it runs under the ocean and through invisible electromagnetic signals in the atmosphere. One that would feel, to the billions of people who experienced it, less like a military attack and more like the world simply stopping working. Iran has not yet cut the cables. The United States has not yet had to execute its most extreme deterrence options. The line has not yet been crossed. But the machinery that would take us to that crossing is running. The preparations are being made. The surveillance systems are active. The cyber weapons are positioned. The proxy forces are in place. The calculations are being made in Tehran and in Washington. The question is not whether this conflict exists. It is already real. It is already being fought in the shadows of the ocean floor and in the invisible corridors of cyberspace. The question is whether the visible world, the world of policy and diplomacy and public pressure, can create enough space, enough off-ramps, enough reasons for restraint before someone makes a decision that the rest of the world cannot undo. History does not always give you a warning before the moment that changes everything. Sometimes it just changes. And what makes this moment different from every other geopolitical crisis you have heard about in your lifetime is that the next escalation would not just affect the countries involved. It would not just affect the Middle East. It would affect every person on this planet who uses the internet, who moves money, who works in any industry that touches digital infrastructure, who relies on the invisible systems we have all decided to trust completely and protect almost not at all. That is everyone. That is you. The cables are on the ocean floor. The soldiers are in the water. The weapons are positioned in cyberspace. And the world is watching the wrong places, reading about the wrong threats, worrying about the wrong wars. The next conflict that changes everything may not begin with a bomb or a missile. It may begin with a silence, a strange, spreading, growing silence, where the loading circle just keeps spinning, where the call drops and never reconnects, where the screen that is supposed to show you the world shows you nothing. And by the time anyone understands what happened, the damage is already done. The question that no one can answer with certainty is the same question that should keep all of us thinking long after this video ends. In a world where the most powerful weapon is a pair of wire cutters at the bottom of the sea, and the most dangerous battleground is invisible, are we actually prepared for what comes next?